Now, several universities in South Africa have implemented a vaccination policy that will require students and staff to present a vaccination certificate for entry into their premises. South Africa's 26-member vice-chancellors body, Universities South Africa, has emphatically declared that vaccination is a must. Some of the universities that have implemented this particular vaccination policy include the University of Johannesburg, the University of Cape Town and Witswatersrand. Will students then be allowed to register for the 2022 academic year without a vaccine certificate? We speak now to Higher Health CEO, Professor Ramneek Ahluwalia. Professor Ahluwalia, a very good afternoon to you. So that then is the very big question. If vaccination is being made mandatory for students as well as staff to be able to physically be on campus, what does this mean for access to education for learners come 2022?
No, thank you, Tammy, and good afternoon to everyone. Tammy, science is very clear from what we've seen from the data about what vaccination does to a human body and how it saves us from COVID-19. And I think that's where the rationale of regulatory vaccination or mandatory vaccination in institutions of higher learning is being thoughtfully put into from the scientific data that we're receiving. So what we've clearly seen is that what vaccine is doing is it's providing three things to our human body. The one is it's preventing the severity of the infection, which means even today with Omicron, which has taken 90% of our current hurricane of infections that we are seeing in South Africa, what we're clearly seeing is that still 90% or even 92% of hospitalizations or severity of the infection is still from the non-vaccinated people. The second thing that the vaccination is also doing is the vaccine immunity, which puts in line towards our second and third line of defense mechanism in our human body. So even if the virus moves into our human body, the chances of it mutating in a vaccinating body versus a non-vaccinated body is far too low, because the vaccinated body has the potential to overcome what we call the virus in itself or the viral load in general. Which means that for the future of business continuity or the whole global world, the vaccine immunity is important for the new variants not to come. And the third thing, which we have also seen, is that because the vaccinated people have milder infections or even most of them remain asymptomatic, the chances of transmission of the virus is far less. So the infectivity of the virus is far lower comparative to the non-vaccinated. So when we have the science in place, every institution of higher learning in South Africa minus the USAf, and remember post-school education is just not the universities, we're also looking into 300 campuses of the technical and vocational colleges, about 1,800 sites of the community education training, which are all vocational skills. And most of these skills were built for contact learning. And what has happened this year, the last 2 years, is that the academic year has seen what we call it as a 30-70 split, which 30% of the students were doing contact learning, while 70% of students were doing online learning. And this has really affected parents who are paying the fees, the students' own graduateness, the competencies of the students, the private sector who's looking for employment, about the skills. I as a doctor, it's very difficult to explain how do we build a medical student remotely. It's practically impossible. Similarly, engineering, plumbing, mining, electrical, every industry that's specific on skills building. So at the end of the day, to make this shift from a 30-70 to a 70-30 split, which we are hoping in 2022, which means 70% of our students can get skills access to a contact learning, whereas 30% of students who are not vaccinated at that time will get access through an online system, will build the skills economy, will build our higher education far more stronger. And I think vaccines play an important and critical role. So some universities have put up a policy which is still in consultations, still in discussion with various formulations, whether it's parent governing bodies, student governance, staff, unions, in particular, in trying to understand what the policy entails towards, which is predominantly a very phased approach of putting regulatory vaccinations, specifically in issues like residences or issues of in-classroom attendance. But every institution is going to open, because we still opened last year in 2021 when there were no vaccine access to anyone, any human mankind. At that time, vaccines were very new to us. Even then, the institutions did open. So the institutions will open. The question will be is how does the phased regulatory approach will start bringing more and more students in the classrooms and in the residences so that more contact learning will happen.
Professor, you've outlined a lot of reasons for vaccination. I'd like to ask you this particular question. When the vaccine started, it was labeled by the vaccine manufacturers as a vaccination trial. Is the communication that the trial is over, has that been communicated? Is that where we are at now? Or are we still in the phase of this being a vaccination trial according to the vaccine manufacturers?
So the vaccine trials was predominantly for Johnson & Johnson. We call it a Sisonke trial, which was predominantly for healthcare workers, where we wanted to check the efficacies of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Just to inform you that all vaccines, and currently over 3.5 billion people in the world have received vaccines. So there's no trial anymore left in this word called vaccine trials, but predominantly the amount of population that's already received one dose or even a 2-dose vaccines, predominantly completing the entire course. Now the world is moving into something called the booster, and I think the government of South Africa is going to announce very soon around the boosters for predominantly both the Pfizer group and the Johnson & Johnson group. So I think the world has gone beyond the trial phases. We've clearly seen, we've clearly notified the efficacies, including what the new variants are being exposed to the new vaccine. So I think we're out of it. The only thing is the Johnson & Johnson Sisonke study still continues on testing now the booster doses on the first cohort of groups that received the first cohort of their first doses of Johnson & Johnson. So I think the vaccine trial program is completed. Why vaccine efficacy has been quite proven by the World Health Organization, including our SHAPRA for at least the 2 vaccines. We're hoping more and more vaccine manufacturers will be then approved in South Africa, giving more variety of choices for South Africans to select from. But all the vaccines clearly have shown at least the one efficacy part, which is severity of the infections, which is exactly the reason why they were built. And this is the reason which is prompting the world to now open businesses and continuity of businesses, clearly indicating that the vaccinated people are not prone for severity the way we are seeing it among the non-vaccinated people.
At what point will learners and staff be required to produce their vaccination certificates?
So, post-school education is quite a big system in itself. We call it a country in itself. Now, we're talking about urban universities, which are the likes of the WITS, the UCT, the Stellenbosch, that we all know about. But comparative to them, we also have rural universities. And why am I saying this? And similarly, we've got very peri-urban and rural areas of TVET colleges. Our vaccination program, when the president opened the vaccination program for the cohort of under 35 years of age, we started building vaccination centers. So we got a whole strategy called the Vaccination Post-School Education Strategy, which every institution of higher learning is putting forward. And that whole strategy speaks to easy access of vaccines for the student and staff, for the community, so that they can focus on education while they have access to vaccinations around them. So we built something called the vaccination centers, and 19 universities in South Africa are vaccination centers, which means they even have storage and they run like accredited vaccination sites. All our TVET colleges are now vaccine points in the remaining universities, which means vaccines come on daily basis in the form of campaigns and easy access to students, and also the linkage to the nearest vaccination sites. So why am I explaining this is because certain universities went very early in their phases of building their vaccination strategy and access to vaccines versus some universities that took time, specifically in the ones in the rural areas, in informal settlements and peri-urban areas. So it's not everything is likewise or similar. So because of that, certain universities have matured their vaccination program, which means they have given a substantial time for vaccine access to their population of student staff, which they will also start doing for the new first years that are joining in the institutions of higher learning. But the question will still be, the question is around the epidemiology, around their own business continuity, around the courses they offer, which means remote learning is practically very challenging versus those institutions where contact learning makes the biggest reason of survival for a graduate competency or skill building. And those institutions then are relooking their infrastructure, they're relooking their systems together and deciding when to put a regulatory vaccination policy together. So not all universities are going to put a policy mandated immediately. Some will watch the space in February, March, while the vaccination maturity program happens. More access of vaccines is provided to students and staff. So it's going to be like this. But eventually the reality is that at one time, every student, every parent will want a skills competency, will want a skills building through contact learning, and that's where the policy of vaccination will probably start moving from one university that starts in the beginning, will move gradually by March to almost all universities and colleges.
Before we wrap up, Professor, for those learners and for those parents who are not comfortable with their children and children themselves, who do not want to take the vaccine come next year, but still do want to get an education, are there facilities that are going to be made available for those learners to be able to access online education without even necessarily compromising their right to access to education and also their right to the access to quality education?
So you're absolutely right. Every student and staff has access to the institutions of higher learning. And the questions what we are debating right now is the in-contact classroom-based learning versus an online remote learning. So the in-contact classroom learning is where an in-contact residence learning, residence living is what the question is, where the transmission of because of the congregation of settings, the transmission rates are predominantly high, mixing people who are not vaccinated, exposing vaccinated people with non-vaccinated, the virus, and also the risk of infectivity to the severity of the infections we've seen for the non-vaccinated people. Now, these are the challenging questions that are in mind. Every student, so far as I am known, for every policy of every institution is giving access to the students to apply in the institutions of higher learning. The challenge is access to the institution in itself, which means in-contact classes. Those students who are joining who are not vaccinated will have access to more into an online learning versus an in-contact classroom basis. Remember, this is not for every institution. This is for those institutions who have moved stages of the consultation and the policy terminologies, whereas many institutions are still reconsidering, still in the consultative processes. So institutions are opening. Everybody is allowed to register. Everybody will register. The questions will be around, like we did in 2021, where more systems were more done on online learning and a very few contact learning positions. The change or the shift is to the more contact learning versus the online learning, so that there is more in-contact learning possibility given and more skills building systems being provided to the students.
Professor,
and that can only be provided which is in contact.
Professor Ramneek Ahluwalia, thank you very much for your time and that update regarding the 2022 academic year, specifically for institutions of higher learning. The professor is the CEO of Higher Health.